Hello everyone, I am Tuhin Mukherjee from Pennsylvania State University, and today I am going to talk about heat transfer and fluid flow modeling of multi-layer additive manufacturing of grade 91 steel. In this project, I work with Professor Tashankar Debroy, and this project is sponsored by US Department of Energy, and the modeling work was performed in Penn State's High Performance Computing Cluster. Grade 91 steel parts are recently made using directed energy deposition additive manufacturing process for nuclear industry. And during this process, the heat transfer and fluid flow affect the thermal cycle and cooling rates, both of which are responsible for controlling the structure and properties of the parts. So in this work, we have developed and used a heat transfer and fluid flow model for multi-layer DED of grade 91 steel. Grade 91 steel is used for nuclear industry for its excellent radiance tolerance. For example, these grade 91 steel parts are traditionally processed for nuclear industry using multi-pass welding, but recently these parts are made using additive manufacturing process. And as you know that grade 91 steel is a martensitic steel, so these parts are susceptible to contain martensite. Essentially here our main objective is to understand the heat transfer and fluid flow during directed energy deposition process of grade 91 steel, because heat transfer and fluid flow affect temperature field, thermal cycle and cooling rate, and they affect the martensite formation and its tempering, uh, both of which essentially affect the properties of the part. So our approach is to develop a 3D transient heat transfer and fluid flow model that can calculate the thermal cycle and cooling rates during additive manufacturing process. The heat transfer fluid flow model takes the process conditions from the experiment, and a thermodynamic model using a commercial package JMath Pro is used to compute the thermophysical properties of grade 91 steel, that is density, temperature dependent thermal conductivity, temperature dependent specific heat, and so on and so forth, that are used in heat and fluid flow model to compute the 3D transient temperature fields from which we can get the thermal cycle and cooling rate. Both of them are responsible for the variation in structure and properties of the part. Specifically, we use a heat transfer and fluid flow model that solves equations of conservation of mass, momentum, and energy in a 3D computational domain that consists of the substrate, deposited layer, powder, and the inert gas surrounding it. So this model considers process parameters and alloy properties as input, and it provides us transient temperature, velocity fields, thermal cycle, cooling rates, solidification parameters as outputs. So let's consider around 250,000 cells to discretize this computational domain in 3D, and we are solving 5 main variables, 3 components of velocities of the convective flow inside the molten pool, pressure, and the enthalpy from which we can calculate the temperature field. So as a whole, we are solving 1.25 million algebraic equations, and um, to get a good convergence, we need to solve these equations iteratively. And let's say we are having 100 iteration per time step. So at the end, we are solving 0.125 billion equations. And to simulate the continuous movement of the laser beam, we discretize that entire time into small time steps, let's say 1000 time steps. So as a whole, we are solving 125 billion equations. And in an inexpensive laptop, it takes just 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, you can get the temperature fields, velocity fields, thermal cycle, cooling rates, everything that you need. So here I am providing one example of the variation in 3D temperature field, both spatially and with time. As you can see, as the heat source, that is the laser beam, progresses along this line, the molten pool also follows the heat source, and the temperature field is stretched just opposite to the scanning direction. So near the heat source, the temperature is high. As we go further from the heat source, the temperature decreases. And this process continues until all layers and hatches are deposited. Like here, I am giving an example of depositing 4 layers. And as you can see, the temperature field is changing with time and with space as more layers are being deposited. These spatial and temporal variations of temperature field actually affects the thermal cycle and local cooling rate, both of which control the structure and property of the component. So as we look close to the molten pool, we can see the temperature is the highest in the region of the heat source, and it decreases as we move further away from the heat source axis. And that temperature difference, spatial difference of temperature, causes the spatial variation in the surface tension, and that drives the velocity of the molten material inside the molten pool. So generally, the molten metal flow is from the high temperature region to the low temperature region. That means from the center of the molten pool to the periphery of the molten pool along the 3D curved surface of the deposit. So as I have shown in the animation that the temperature field changes when we deposit multiple layers. So for a particular location, the temperature varies as multiple layers are deposited. For example, this picture is showing the temperature field during the deposition of first layer, and the white dot, that is the monitoring location for the thermal cycle called point A. We are interested to see how temperature changes at that location when we deposit multiple layers. So while depositing the first layer, the temperature inside the molten pool is the temperature of the monitoring location point A. That's very high, above the solidus temperature of the alloy. As we deposit the second layer, you can see the monitoring location A experiences a little less temperature, a little lower than the solidus temperature of the alloy. As we deposit the third layer, the temperature decreases further, and as we deposit the fourth layer, temperature decreases even further. So as we monitor the temperature at location A while depositing multiple layers, we can capture the temperature variation with time. This is something like this, and this is called the thermal cycle. And this thermal cycle has immense effect on the structure and properties of the component. So we compare the computed thermal cycle with experimentally measured thermal cycle, and this is done for H13 tool steel, which has a similar property as grade 91 steel. Um, this is the computational domain, and we are depositing single track, and temperature is measured in a location A as it is shown in this inset. The computed results agree reasonably well with the experimental results, and that gives us the confidence that this kind of modeling result can be used to further investigate the heat transfer and fluid flow during additive manufacturing process. Um, from the thermal cycle, if we look at the slope of thermal cycle during cooling, that is the cooling rate. at a particular temperature. So since grade 91 steel is a martensitic steel, we are interested to look at the cooling rates at the martensitic start temperature. So for grade 91 steel, the martensitic start temperature is around 673 Kelvin. And if we extract the slope of thermal cycle at that temperature, that is the cooling rate at that temperature, we can see the cooling rate values are around 500 Kelvin per second depending on the processing condition. And with the increase in power, the cooling rate decreases as expected. But these cooling rate values are much higher than the critical cooling rate of martensite formation for grade 91 steel. That's just 0.05 Kelvin per second. Since this is a martensitic steel, so this is highly susceptible to form martensite when it is processed using additive manufacturing. So, like the thermal cycle that we found out for one particular location, we can compute thermal cycles at different location in the part and for different layers. And for all layers, we can see that the temperature variation with time varies significantly. So it heats up and then gradually cools down as the deposition process progresses. So all location in the part experience repeated heating and cooling during the deposition of multiple layers. And since grade 91 steel is a martensitic steel, during the deposition of multiple layers, the reheating and cooling partially tempers the martensite and form tempered martensite. So the amount of martensite that it contains and amount of tempered martensite it contains, that essentially controls the hardness of the component. So we published similar results for H13 tool steel earlier this year in Acta Materialia, and same thing we are doing for grade 91 steel. So as a summary, you can appreciate that grade 91 steel is now widely used for nuclear industry, and the parts are made by directed energy deposition additive manufacturing process. And during that process, heat transfer fluid flow controls the cooling rate and thermal cycle, both of which affect the structure and properties of the components. So to understand the heat transfer and fluid flow of that process, we developed and used a heat transfer and fluid flow model of DED process, and we validate the computed result using independent experimental data. And we saw that the cooling rate, computed cooling rate during DED of grade 91 steel are much higher than the critical cooling rate of martensite formation. And this is very much expected because grade 91 steel is a martensitic steel. It should contain martensite in the part. And we can see from the computed result that um, every locations of the component experience repeated heating and cooling during the deposition of multiple layer, and that reheating and recooling affect the amount of martensite and convert some part of martensite into tempered martensite and reduce the hardness. But how much martensite will transform to tempered martensite? We need more research to understand that by combining the result of heat transfer fluid flow with the tempering kinetics of martensite to understand how much it affects the hardness and other mechanical properties. Thank you very much.